Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Foreign Press Association uh, here in New York, where we're hosting Marshall Curry, a filmmaker whose film was nominated for an Oscar last year, did win an Academy, I believe, short documentary. And it's a blissfully short documentary with the current attention span. It's a mere 7 minutes, The Night at the Garden. And it was very timely because, as we saw, a lot of the participants, the what you might call the extras, the casting, this movie almost was a casting call for January the 6th in a way. It was cast of thousands. Cecil B. DeMille running for the for the for the January 6th events, and it is very timely because it's not that we want necessarily to pull the United States down. Nobody does. But there is a sense that the United States feels itself excluded from other people's sins. One of the things which I've read recently is Hitler's American Model, which shows how the Nazi lawmakers who drew up the Nuremberg laws actually studied the American laws on segregation for background and rejected it because they were too inhumane and strict. They only took a lot of them. They didn't take the full amount. It's a stunning book, I mean, because it doesn't actually dwell on these things. It's just that little comment. So when you see this video, I think you will see that it's stunning that this was happening. We should remember, I don't think you mentioned it in the documentary, that according to some newspaper reports, the father of the current president was one of the people who was running around with a quasi-Nazi uniform, Sieg Heilig.
Not the current president, our past president.
No, the past president, yes.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Everybody
Everybody knows that Trump 45 is still the president. You're showing your left-wing bias, Marshall. So we need to, Marshall is going to explain the background to how he made the film, where he found the footage, and the inspiration behind it and the difficulties, I suppose. Then we'll watch the movie and then we can discuss it between ourselves. And, it's all the more effective because it's so pointed, it's short, sharp, directed, and the imagery is, it's not quite up there with the Berlin Olympics, but it's well done. It's.
They wished it were. Yeah, the people who were filming it, I think they had a little triumph of the will in their minds when
Yes, they had her along as a script consultant, perhaps.
Right.
Okay, then. Well, let's move over to Marshall. Explain the genesis of the film. How you stumbled across the footage. What was your reaction? How did you get the idea of making a documentary, and what was the reception?
So I, grew up in America. I've taken many years of American history, world history, and this I did not know about at all. And it's been so interesting as we've released the film to discover how many people have never heard of this event. But I was with a friend of mine who's a screenwriter at dinner, and he was working on a script that takes place in New York in 1939. And he told me that in his research, he had discovered that there had been this rally of Nazis who filled Madison Square Garden. And I couldn't believe it. It seemed like something that every school kid would have heard about in school. And so the honest truth is I didn't really even believe he was right. I got home that night and I Googled it and saw that there were photographs from it. And the photographs were chilling. They're, this 30-foot portrait of George Washington with swastikas on either side of him, and all of
they didn't pencil in a mustache, though. They had some decency.
Right. And then I realized that there were some historical documentaries that had short clips from the rally in the documentaries. And I realized, okay, if there's a little bit of footage, there's got to be a lot more, because nobody takes a camera into an event to shoot 20 seconds or 30 seconds. And so I started working with an archival researcher who I knew from my other documentaries. And he started calling around to archives and asking people about it. And it turned out that there were portions of the footage in the National Archive, in the American National Archive. There were some Some of the footage was in UCLA's archive, Grinberg archive. So there were kind of pieces of it in lots of different places, but it had not ever been pulled together. And it's my expectation that there's a lot more of this footage that exists or that was originally shot that we weren't able to find. So it either has been destroyed or lost, or I guess one of those two, because we weren't able to turn it up. But we were able to turn up a good chunk of footage. And in some cases, like the National Archive had film, but it had never been scanned high definition before. And so we gathered all the footage that we could find, and I watched it, and my jaw just dropped, because it was a stunning rally. The things that were said, the way that the icons of patriotism were used, were shocking.
This was serious film stock, though, isn't it? It's not somebody's home movie on an 8mm.
No. They shot it on film, of course. You know, in the 1930s, there was no home video, so yeah. So they were shooting it on either 16 or possibly even 35mm film, and as far as we know, it was shot by the group that was holding the rally. So your mention of the Berlin Olympics is not far off. I think that they shot it with this idea of it being used as a propaganda film for how glorious the American Nazi Party, which was called the Bund at that point, was. And so they shot it with a very different intention than the way that we are using it today. But I saw the footage, I was shocked by it, and I thought people need to see this. And so I originally had an idea to make a whole documentary about this event, and you get historians, and then I realized one day, I just started playing with the footage, and I realized there was a real power to just dropping the audience into this setting with no explanation and letting people puzzle out what was going on. And it took a lot of time to edit it in the way that I did. And if you want, we can talk a little bit about that afterward. But I thought maybe I should just make something that's very short, that doesn't explain what you're seeing, and it's more provocative than it is didactic. It's just to get people to say, what is this? What is this? And then they can go on the internet and research this group and research what happened. And so we did that. It premiered at Sundance, at the film festival there. Then it played at the New York Film Festival, and then pretty quickly we wanted to just put it online. So we put it up for free on Vimeo and YouTube, and we just wanted to keep it short. We wanted people to be able to see it, to share it with each other. And then, as you mentioned, it got nominated for an Academy Award. I understand that it is the shortest film to be nominated for an Academy Award in 50 years or something like that. So I don't know, maybe we should just watch it, and then afterward we can talk about it.
undivided allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, American patriots, I'm sure I do not come before you tonight as a complete stranger. You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social, just, white, Gentile, ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
he was the leader of the Deutsche Amerikanische Bund, wasn't he?
Yes, so that the man who was speaking is Fritz Kuhn. He was the head of the German American Bund, which was kind of the American Nazi Party. And in addition to having this rally, they had, you know, big marches in New York City. They had camps for children and families with, you know, Adolf Hitler Road, and where children in, you know, little Nazi type uniforms would go out and raise the flag and goose step around, and sort of like a scout camp, but with a Nazi ideology. And they were in some ways kind of a fringy group. You know, I think most Americans consider them to be kooks in a way, but needless to say, they represented the anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant, you know, racist values of a lot more people than those who actually participated at that rally.
But they're also able to capitalize on the anti-war sentiment in the United States, weren't they?
That's right. I mean, they, of course,
keeping America out of the war.
Keeping America out of the war. America first was, of course, a phrase coined by that same group. The you know, the Lindbergh, the Henry Ford, the William Randolph Hearst contingent, who were in some cases sympathetic to fascism and sympathetic to the Nazis movement that was rising in Europe. But that's what was so shocking when Donald Trump grabbed America first as a slogan. I don't know whether he doesn't know American history to realize how that sounds to a lot of people, or whether he does know American history. Both of them are upsetting possibilities.
But their work against the war was very, very effective. They managed to get a lot of what we might call sort of non-German Americans along at the time.
Well, I mean, you know, Kristallnacht had already happened by the time this rally occurred, and of course Hitler was building concentration camps as this was happening. But it would be 2 more years before America would enter the war, and would only do it when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So it does make you wonder what would have happened if there had been a different president who was not eager to confront fascism, or if the Japanese had not bombed Pearl Harbor. You know, the goal of this film, as you mentioned, is not to beat up on America. I love my country, but it is to be a cautionary tale that everybody is vulnerable to the temptation of demagogues, and that you know, even people who seem like good Americans, they can be lured to do terrible things and to support terrible things by a leader who's funny and mean, and you know, people who wrap American icons of George Washington and the flag around themselves to sell this stuff. So, and of course, it's also not something that's just happening in America. It seems like around the world we are seeing a growth of the anti-democratic, small d democratic, you know, anti-immigrant, anti-outsider point of view, and it's taking a lot of countries. It's sweeping a lot of countries and a lot of cultures.
Of course, it wasn't just America. In Britain, Sir Oswald Mosley was having similar black shirt rallies, and he wasn't even using expatriate Germans for it. They were indigenous Brits, including aristocrats like himself, the baronet of the realm, parading about and doing the whole Hitler salute thing. So it's not a unique American guilt, but I think it's the shock of seeing it in Madison Square Garden is something that people inured to the idea that the finest generation, those of us from Europe who was, well, our family home was bombed out twice while we were waiting for America to join in. Thank you when you did, though. We have other people who are asking, Sandra Muller, did you feel in danger when you made the documentary? And will it be broadcast in Europe, particularly France?
I did not feel in danger. I did worry a little bit that it was possible that it would be seen as a pro-Nazi film. You know, there's no voice of God telling you how to feel. There's no academic. It doesn't cut to any interviews to frame it. It's just drops you into an event and hopes that you make sense of it. It does have a point of view. The way that we used music and the way that we edited it is very different from the people who shot it. The original footage has this jaunty military music, and I wanted to kind of subvert their goal. You know, again, I mentioned that their goal was to use it.
You like subversion.
Yeah, they were trying to make a triumph of the will type of thing, and I wanted to add a little more critical eye. So my music is a little more anxious and a little more inquisitive. And there are a few other places where, you know, I framed shots maybe a little differently. There's one moment in the film where they're beating up the Jewish protester who's run out on stage, who we can talk about. And there's a little boy in the crowd who's watching, who's up on stage, who's watching, and he kind of does this little dance of excitement as he watches this man get beaten up in front of him. And that was actually sort of in the background of one of the shots. And so I reframed and zoomed because I really wanted people to notice that kid. To me, that kid is you know, the human vulnerability to get excited by being part of a mob. There's a thrill in being part of a mob, and I wanted to kind of highlight that feeling. And then another one of the things that you'll notice, it was the way that I slow things down a lot as the protesters being tossed off stage. That happens in just a couple of seconds, but I really wanted you, instead of connecting with the people who were beating him up, as you might do if it played in real time, I wanted to slow it down so that you could see his face and you could see the fear and you could see his expressions, with the hope that the audience would connect with his experience and the way that he was feeling and experiencing this rally.
So in your research, what happened to him?
So his name was Isidor Greenbaum. He was a 20-something-year-old plumber's assistant from Brooklyn, Jewish plumber's assistant who just went to the rally that night to kind of check it out. And he didn't have any plans to protest, but when he heard what was being said on stage, he was so shocked and appalled that he felt like he just had to run out on stage to try to confront it in some way. And he ended up getting arrested that night. The New York Times coverage of the event is really interesting. And if people go to unitedthegarden.com, there are some links to the New York Times articles covering it. But according to the Times, the next day he was released after paying a $25 fine for disturbing the peace. And the article says that the magistrate asked him, you know, don't you realize somebody could have been really hurt by what you did on stage by disturbing the peace? And Isidor Greenbaum replied, well, don't you realize someone's gonna be hurt by the things that were being set up on that stage? And of course, this is 1939, so we know what it was about to happen to millions of Jews and others. So
shame there was the camera in the courtroom. That would have been a great
he ended up joining the military, and there was a big story on him in Stars and Stripes magazine, which is the military newspaper during World War II, that celebrated that he was the guy who had gone out and taken on the Bund. And so we got in touch or heard from his grandson. Isidor is dead now, but his grandson got in touch. And so that was fun to kind of connect with him and learn a little more about the real person who ran out on stage and took on 20,000 Nazis by himself.
I'm sort of surprised that he wasn't that he wasn't denied promotion for being a premature anti-fascist, which happened to some people.
Well, by the time the war started, I think that story was you know, we welcomed that story. It's funny how our feelings about protests change depending on what period of history we're in. So in the 1939, maybe you get arrested. By 1941, you're a hero for having taken on the Nazis. So one other just detail about him, there was an article in the Washington Post that came out after the film that did a whole story about him, about Isidor Greenbaum, and in it they quoted him where he would often tell the story about running out on stage that night, and people would say, well, weren't you afraid? Why did you do what you do? Why did you do what you did? And his response to them was, gosh, what would you have done in that situation? And I've always thought that's a great question for us in the face of growing anti-democracy, growing fascism, growing anti-immigrant. What would we do? Where are we in our history? And what will we want to say to our grandchildren about what we said and did?
You could almost be forgiven in the face of 20,000 stormtroopers for saying, I'll sit this one out. All kudos to him. The other thing that struck me is I'm a great fan of counterfactuals, and Philip K. Dick's novel, The Man in the High Castle, was turned into a famous Amazon series, which mostly came out pretty well because it dealt with the same sense of shock when you saw ordinary Americans participating in things like this. And they did it in a very realistic way. So I think this is part of the same shock effect that you achieved, that this looks so natural. Those people, you could go and buy hardware across the counter from them somewhere. They looked like shopkeepers and normal bourgeois citizens hanging about. And the fact that they were engaging in something like this, which we now know is profoundly anti-American.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for Americans to look at the Germans and shake our head at how they could have done what they did. And I think that was what was so surprising to me, to see that footage. Is, these are folks that dropped off the kids at the babysitter and put on their hats and suits and dresses and went out to an evening at a pro-America rally at Madison Square Garden to, laugh and cheer as a Jewish protester is beaten up on stage in front of them, and outside as well. I don't think those police were holding back Nazis in the opening shots. There was a significant counter protest that was happening outside, and it's many reports have it numbered in the thousands of how many people were out there. We've got several other questions coming in. Ted Folk, who is a filmmaker in his own right, many thanks for important film. Did you have any problems getting the rights to any of this material? This is spoken from the heart, because I know he tries to get these things. Yeah, we did not. Some of it we had to pay for. Other parts of it is free. So footage from the National Archive is owned by the American public. So we had to pay lab fees because, as I mentioned, that they had film prints that had never been scanned high def before. So there were expenses from some places, just those lab fees, and in other places we did have to license it. I can't remember. I think Grinberg and UCLA have a license fee that you have to pay per second, but there was no. It was just a matter of coming up with the money. Well, somewhere in Germantown on the Upper East Side in an attic is probably the rest of this film. I do wonder if it's under a bed somewhere. Yeah. The other question from Ted is, do you see this leading into a larger project, or have you put "Fini, that's all, folks" at the end of the stock and that's it? I mean, I find it really interesting, and I've heard from a number of other folks who have seen it, who have talked about developing things. So I have other projects that I'm working on right now, so probably not for me, but I hope that other people will pick up this story, and there will be feature documentaries about this group. And I know that there's some fiction projects, telling the story that are being developed. So, it's my goal that this footage just becomes part of American history, in the same way that the footage of young Black protesters being hosed off in the South during the Civil Rights Movement are part of our history. It's important to be aware of the true stories of how your country was formed. So I don't feel any sort of sense of ownership of it. I just hope lots of people will continue to share it and learn from it. And we've got another filmmaker chipping in here, Jeff Gold,
thanks you for this important film. And he says, we discussed the documentary last evening during our Living New Deal online events, which he'd held. The New Deal and far-right extremism. Very timely. Well done, Jeff. Question, did you manage to find any survivors of that rally, either participants or opponents, however elderly now? So this is the interesting bit, that you don't find many people saying, yes, during the 1930s, I was fighting for the Führer in New York.
Right. We did not. 1939, it would have been 80 years ago. So a 10-year-old who went to the rally would be 90. So there may well be someone alive who was at that rally. One thing that was interesting, though, was when the movie was released, I did hear from lots of folks who said my mother or my grandmother or my grandfather was there, either protesting it or attending it. We heard from some folks who said my parents went, but they told us that they thought it was just going to be a pro-America, rally. They didn't realize that the Nazis were a part of it, or that the Bund was a part of it. I have actually a good friend who I grew up with, whose grandfather was a police officer who worked there that night, and my friend's father told me that when he was growing up, his father, the police officer, would tell stories about the night that he had to work as a policeman at the Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden. So it was definitely part of their family lore.
Well, another question following on from Jeff here is the question of, in the words of the song, which side were they on? Which side were they on? Like your copper, did he regard this as a patriotic duty to defend the rally? Or
I think he was doing his job, and he thought that these people were kooks, but it was his job to keep the peace that night, and so he was just doing his job. So it is interesting to try to gauge how much these folks, how much support these folks had during the time, because again, the New York Times, I think, from the time gives us an insight. And if people are subscribers to the New York Times, then they have access to the digital archive, which is terrific if you're interested in history at all. You can go, and it's called the Times Machine, and you can put in any date, and it'll show you a scan of the actual newspaper, and you can flip through the pages and see how they covered historical events at the time. And so the day after and a couple of days after this rally, you can go and read those articles. And there was a debate in the newspaper about whether the Bund should have been allowed to have a rally. And that was another thing that I thought was so interesting, was how similar the dynamics of that debate were to the dynamics that we have today of allowing people, free speech. And at the time, the consensus was that this group should be allowed to have free speech. So the leading Jewish group said these people are anti-democratic, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-American, but they should be allowed to say what they think. We should not interfere with people's ability to say what they think. And the difference between America and fascist Germany is that in America, even idiots are allowed to say what they think. Like, that's the rule. And then, of course, there were other people who said, sure, they should be allowed to say what they think, but should we be giving them a platform like Madison Square Garden to say it in? And I think that's very similar to the debates that we're having on college campuses in America and things like that, where some group says, oh, if such and such right-wing, racist wants to speak on the campus, they should be allowed to. And other people say, okay, but they shouldn't be allowed to do it we shouldn't give them a forum that legitimizes that point of view. We won't prevent them from standing on a street corner and saying what they think or printing a pamphlet, but we don't need to give them forum, and we don't need to act like their point of view is a legitimate, normal point of view.
Well, there's the question of the sort of binary politics. Is the Communist Party was also holding rallies at the time. If you got a rally of X thousand communists all staunchly praising the work of our great leader, the Void, in the USSR, how were they treated?
Yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, one of the groups outside, I mean, many of the groups outside were socialists or communists, sort of workers' parties were the leading anti-fascist movement of the 1930s. So, yeah, it's complicated questions.
Roger Kaplan's weighed in with a couple of provoked, I think, possibly by our discussion there, regarding the normality of the people who were marching through Yorkville. How many German-American Bundists ended up as spies during the war? And how does Kuhn compare to, say, France's Colonel de la Roque or England's Oswald Mosley in terms of what he did during the war? Oswald Mosley was interned for much of the duration of the war, and there was a lot of controversy. He was let out. George Orwell had good points about Oswald Mosley. He said it was right to intern him, and if there'd been invasion, he should have been shot. But it was also right to let him out when he was no longer a threat. A robust attitude. What about Kuhn?
Fritz Kuhn was also arrested during the war, although he was arrested for embezzling money from his own organization. So there was a crime.
Drumpf.
Exactly. So he was imprisoned and was kept in prison during the war. After the war, he was stripped of his citizenship, actually, and deported to Germany, where he died sort of poor and unknown.
No pension?
In West Germany, yeah. Which, is its own kind of interesting thing, because on one hand, when I hear that he had his citizenship taken from him, I think that's great. We should do that. On the other hand, the idea of stripping an American citizen of his citizenship because he says things that I think are offensive, and being deported, there's something problematic about that too. So I think all these.
Well, Paul Robeson had his passport taken. I mean, there's sort of if each action has an equal and opposite reaction across the spectrum in some ways, doesn't it? Where do Eva Schweitzer says, do you think US racism served as a model for fascists overseas? Well, I think I partly answered that with the book. It was the model for the Nuremberg laws, pure and simple. But how much was this seen abroad, and how much was it emulated?
Well, I think that that this brand of fascism, the German American Bund, was not so much a source of inspiration for the Nazis. I think that actually went the other way. So Fritz Kuhn modeled himself. He called himself the American Führer, and they took their cultural cues and ideological cues from the Nazis, from Hitler and what was happening in Germany. And Hitler, of my understanding, actually didn't like what was happening with this group. And I think he felt like it was better for him if we let that sleeping giant lie while he consolidated power. He was worried that an anti-democratic or fascist or Nazi movement in the United States would alert Americans and make them more likely to want to get involved in the war against him. So he was not super supportive of what Kuhn was doing. I noticed.
I mean, the Nazis, for all of their many faults, were shrewd political operators, and they must have felt it was a bit odd to put somebody sounding like a cross between Dr. Strangelove and Henry Kissinger up on a platform rallying, saying "America first." I mean, I presume they would have preferred a much more indigenous American presence if they were going to actually seriously have influence and win hearts and minds.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they did. There's been a lot of writing about how they tried to influence Hollywood, and in some places how Hollywood pushed back. And I see some of the other questions back to the sort of interplay between American, whether it's the treatment of Native Americans or Japanese Americans or African Americans or American Jews. all of that, I think, there was some cross pollination between those ideas in Germany and what was happening in America. And in some cases, it was very mainstream in America. I think that the Bund was seen as a fringy group, but Father Coughlin was a radio host who had a regular talk show that went into 30 million American homes, where he said good things about Hitler and Mussolini, and
Henry Ford was fairly prominent as well,
Henry
as I remember.
Ford as well. A number, William Randolph Hearst, Lindbergh. There were a number of folks who were very mainstream business leaders, political leaders, social figures who were, either sympathetic to or supportive of anti-Semitism and anti-democratic philosophies.
It's interesting they chose George Washington.
They considered George Washington to be the original fascist. So,
which he had jackboots on in the picture, I noticed, very prominent. I don't know whether they had.
Well, and it just shows how groups can grab, the icons of something, whether it's the flag or the founding fathers or, the Star Spangled Banner and the Pledge of Allegiance, and wrap them around anything they want. And they have done that for thousands of years. Like, that's the oldest trick for a demagogue, is to say, we need to, keep our pure group, wrap ourselves in flags, wrap ourselves in patriotism, to the exclusion of anyone who might possibly pollute our group. And they were doing the same thing, and we see it today. I mean, the things that are sold in the United States as being patriotic, that I think are clearly anti-American, anti-democratic. They're anti-patriotic. It's remarkable how the symbols of patriotism are used to sell ideas that are anti-American.
It is sort of touching to see people waving Confederate flags in support of the party of Abraham Lincoln, right, for example.
It's really, it's a big disconnect, isn't it?
Fairly. So, I mean, what other projects do you have that can illustrate? Because obviously this is a timely subject. I mean, the nature, regardless of the actual, how should we say, ideology being espoused, I mean, is QAnon on the face of it left or right? It's, apart from being completely bizarre and bonkers. I mean, it's difficult to work on the spectrum. I see some of the people on the left and listen to what they have to say about, they're joining forces on vaccination with people on the right, for example.
Right,
and right. There does seem to be a detachment from reality, which is general throughout different ends of the political spectrum.
Right. I think that's right. I think that's true. I am particularly concerned about the growth of right-wing radicals, though, because I think they tend to be a little more aggressive in their violence than left-wingers. I made a documentary that was nominated for an Oscar a few years ago called If a Tree Falls, about the Earth Liberation Front, which is a radical environmental group that would burn timber companies, and the government considered them to be terrorists, and they considered themselves to be like the Boston Tea Party, doing symbolic property destruction to draw attention to things. And so the movie has a very complicated point of view that takes very seriously the question of whether these people are terrorists or not. But what they always pointed out was that of all of these fires, and they were multi-million-dollar fires, very, many of them dangerous, nobody's ever been hurt in any of them over many years. And in contrast, the number of people who've been killed by right-wing terrorists in the United States is significant and growing. So I do think that both the left and the right have radical sides, but I would not want to make them. I wouldn't want to pretend like they are equivalent dangers to our country.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get back to the question of freedom of speech and access. There's so many people trying to ban everybody else. There are calls for bans on anti-Semites, but then the definition of an anti-Semite is expanded to anybody who thinks that Netanyahu doesn't change his underpants daily. I mean, you on the other hand, you've got some very serious stuff going where people are saying, no, they deserve free speech. There are people can espouse the wackiest racial theories if they can dress it in a little science, and that's okay.
I mean, my take on that is that people should not be prohibited from saying the things that they believe, no matter how outlandish it is, as long as it doesn't, infringe on rights of other people to be safe. And as long, to me, the real question is not whether people should be allowed to do it or not, but how should the media cover it, and what sort of platforms should they be given? So my feelings about the way that social media, Facebook and Twitter, have become sort of cesspools for hateful groups to find each other and amplify each other. That's not a free speech question. That's a question of how a private company's algorithm is being used to boost, hateful ideology. So I do think we should separate the true question of free speech, which is, should the government be allowed to regulate what you say, from the question of, should a particular business be allowed to regulate what you say, or should
well, this was Angela Merkel's point about Trump. I think she definitely wanted Trump to be shut up, but she didn't think that a private company like Twitter should do it.
Yeah.
A view I sometimes, to some extent, sympathize with.
Well, on one hand, I have to say that as soon as he got pushed off of Twitter, the emotional temperature in the United States cooled 20 degrees that day, and there really has been no negative. Like, I don't think anybody I truly don't think anybody has lost their ability to speak. He's the former president. He was the president at the time. He has plenty of ways of getting his point of view across. And for a private company to say that you can't do this, to me, that's the same. If I had a store and somebody came in and started shouting Nazi ideology, I would be in my rights to say, you can't come into my store. If I have a newspaper, I don't have to print everything that anybody wants to have printed. And I feel like, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram should have similar rules about the kinds of speech that they allow.
Okay, devil's advocacy. So you've got no objection, and if Twitter stops a unionization campaign, any tweets in support of a unionization campaign at Amazon?
No, I'm not saying that.
Free speech.
Yeah, I don't think that free speech is the reason. To me, they are within their legal right, of course, to do that. But I think there should be pushback. So I just think that there are social norms that should be followed, and certain types of hate speech, it weakens their ability to create a forum for people to have thoughtful intellectual conversations. And so I guess in the same way that they should get bots off, I don't think there should be fake bots. I think that those degrade the conversation that's happening in those places. And similarly, I think that certain kinds of trolling speech and hate speech, I don't see a need for it to be allowed onto a private. The
question is framing it in a way that does not have the implications.
Yeah.
Isn't it? I mean, one of the things with Trump and the others, how do you censor a dog whistle?
Yeah.
You can't hear the dog whistle.
Yeah, I don't think these are easy questions. They're not very clean black and white questions, but I don't think we should just allow anything because there's not a clean black and white answer.
Okay, so you're prepared to allow your films to be censored if necessary?
Not by the government, but if Twitter decided that they didn't want to show my film. In fact, Facebook was knocking it down, I think, originally when we put it up on Facebook, because their people didn't understand the point of view. They thought that it was a pro-Nazi film, and so the algorithm was knocking down its ability to find audiences. So you know, this stuff is flawed.
Which does get to a point, the question I was going to ask earlier about, could you show it in Germany? Because they have quite strict rules about display of Nazi regalia, don't they?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. You know, it has a point of view that I think is pretty clear, but it's true that it's not. You know, I think that you can show those things in museums, and I would argue that this is kind of the film equivalent of a
Yeah, we have an answer coming in from Ava Schweitzer. Yes, you can. It's a documentary.
Right.
And Ava incidentally wrote, published a fascinating book about the Germans from on the other foot, who were sort of wiped out almost as an ethnicity in the First World War. You know, which started with hundreds of German language newspapers and ended up with none during the First World War. So
wow.
There was a sort of, the Deutsche Amerikanische Bund was actually, how should I say, a bit of a ricochet. A lot of people felt they'd been badly done to. And it was the same way a lot of people were very sympathetic to Germany because they felt Versailles was such a disaster.
Right.
And Hitler capitalized on that. Ava assures me that she didn't write it, she published it. I thought I'd said that, but never mind. Here we go.
Sounds like good work, important work.
It was. It's so we're almost coming towards the end now. Any very last minute questions, or any last minute thoughts for you, Marshall, based on the discussion?
No, I mean, I love what you all are doing, and I'm happy to be able to share the film. And again, if people had problems hearing it, or I noticed it was a little jumpy, so the filmmaker in me wants to make sure that people have the perfect experience. But it's online at a night at the Garden, and please share it on Twitter with your followers. And you know, it's interesting because it came out a few years ago, but every 6 months or so, there's some political event that makes it feel very relevant, and suddenly we'll see a big explosion in the number of people who are watching it, and then it'll die out again and then explode again. And I keep hoping for the day in which that footage just seems like a weird, bizarre part of American history and has no connection to anything that's happening. That'll be a great day when people are not interested in this film because they don't see any connection between it and the current political situation.
I regret to say that I think it's a keeper. I mean, I wish it got shelved the way you say, but I really think it's going to be a keeper. Just to finish off, Erika Jakubasa, show the film in Germany and film reactions. She'd be happy to do it. I'll put you in touch afterwards.
Perfect.
And she's echoed several other people who are thanking you for this important work. And it's coming to the end. So on behalf of the Foreign Press Association, thank you, Marshall. Thank you for the film. I said it's incredibly timely. You know, they've seen this, the sites, except, you know, they had better uniforms in the 1939 than they did on Capitol Hill. I didn't see anybody there with a buffalo horn helmet at all. No dress sense. Our next event is April the 1st, which is semi-ironic. It's April Fool's Day, and we're talking about a new Secretary General. And it's regrettable that it should be, it should almost be an April Fool's joke because the phalanx of the Permanent Five is lined up to stop it happening. So we have the editor of Pass Blue, who writes about the UN, Dulcie Lineback, Stephanie Fillon and Sona Lee Lassiter, and our executive board member, Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera, an all-woman lineup. I can take her backstage, thank God. And we're discussing why we need a new Secretary General and why it should be a woman. So you're all welcome to that on April the 1st. Look out for it. And it should be an interesting one. Because everybody keeps saying what a good idea it is and then making sure nothing happens about it. So thank you once again from the Foreign Press Association. God, why do I keep getting this wrong? Foreign Press Association here in New York. Thank you to Marshall Curry, and thank you all for coming. And we hope to see you next time, April the 1st. In the meantime, we're also trying to hold something about the Cuomo dynasty. We want to explore the roots of animosity in certain quarters of the Democratic Party to the governor, which we've got no end of true bills of indictment against him from them. Thanks very much, Marshall. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me and for sharing the film. Thanks for everybody.
Thank you.
For listening.
Goodbye.